Hello and welcome to episode 87 of Linux Dev Time. I'm Joe.
I'm Amalith.
And I'm Kevin.
Good to talk to you both again on a totally brand new show that is definitely not just a rebrand of Linux Downtime or anything. So we've been going in this direction for a while. We've been talking quite a lot about what it's like to be a developer on Linux and for Linux and using Linux. And so we thought it was time to just change the name of the show. It's still LDT, which is handy. But the idea is to have similar conversations to what we have been doing over the last few months, but to just keep it with kind of a dev focus. So today we want to talk about sharpening your tools. This is something that as developers, you two are tempted to do all the time, right? Changing your setups, the various tools you use, and that can lead to not getting an awful lot of work done.
Yeah, it's definitely a form of procrastination on my part, especially when there's hard things to do at work. It's really easy to fall back into, well, let me just fix my Vim config, or let me try out this new terminal or something along those lines. However, I think you can also get some really valuable setups by messing with your tools every so often.
Yeah, I've been using the same desktop setup, probably line for line, since 2018 or something. And at the time, it was just messing with my desktop and making it look and work nicely and fluidly. But I found that that's still the most productive workflow for me.
So how much have you tried out different configs or key bindings or anything of that nature? Are you just really, really settled on this one set, or do you try out new things from time to time?
I do try out new things sometimes, but it usually ends in, this is different. My muscle memory isn't working. I want to go back. So it's a little bit of both. One, I think it is really productive, but two, it's also what I'm used to.
I've definitely felt that. Although there are a few times that I've also changed out some even hardware-based components that I think have made a big difference. For example, I'm a big keyboard fan. I like all kinds of different keyboards. One of the things that I changed was switching to a split ortholinear keyboard, which means all the keys are in a column versus staggered like a normal keyboard. And that took a while to get used to the point where I almost had to have a second keyboard next to me for when I really needed to type in that password or something that I couldn't see. But once I pushed through that a little bit, I found that my joints hurt less. It was just overall more productive. I was able to put in nicer key bindings. So I think that's one of those few times that paid off for me. But there's definitely been times that haven't.
You say you like all kinds of keyboards, Kevin. Do you like the Logitech K400 Plus that I use as a daily driver?
I like that you have it.
So that you don't have to.
I can't say I've ever tried that particular keyboard. Right now, I'm using, this is a ErgoDox Easy.
Hey, that's what I have.
Oh, I love it. For work, I use a Moonlander, also from ZSA. And that is an amazing keyboard. I absolutely love it. But it took a lot of getting used to, that's for sure.
I don't use mine because I never got used to it. I just kept going back to the old keyboard. And then eventually I got a better version of that keyboard, sort of. I have the Logitech MX Mechanical, and it's been nice. I still intend to use the ErgoDox, but I've had it for 4 years now and still haven't.
Well, if you ever get around to it, it's definitely worth it, at least in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. My problem was going a little bit too far down the keyboard rabbit hole. I tried setting it up with Programmer Dvorak with some other customizations, and I just had no clue where anything was. It was terrible. I think if I put it back to the default QWERTY, it would be easier now.
Is that one of those times where changing too much all at once leads to these unproductive times that were ultimately a waste?
Yeah, I think so. I put a lot of time into trying to learn that layout, and I've forgotten it all by now. When I could have been using what I knew and being productive.
Yeah, I think for the most part, the times where I've had the most success, whether it be Vim key bindings or what have you, have always been trying to do a little bit at a time.
Yes.
And move from there. There was an article recently talking about sharpening your tools, and one of the things that they stated was a quote from I'm not sure who, that if your life depended on cutting down a tree in 5 minutes, you should spend the first 3 minutes sharpening your axe. I'm curious, Amalith, how long would you spend sharpening your axe? if you had to cut down this tree?
Probably less than that. Spending over half the time just preparing seems like a little bit much.
Wouldn't you spend a few minutes Googling how to do it first?
Yes, I would. I've never sharpened an axe. I'd have to figure that out first.
I'd have to figure out how to cut the tree down as well.
I think dipping into that rabbit hole a little bit can be very useful. You just have to be careful about not going too far and eventually getting sucked in.
What gets me about that particular quote is you almost have to know how long it's going to take you to sharpen the axe and what the benefit is of continuing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the hardest things I think with development in general is it's really hard to know when you're going to fall into a rabbit hole that eventually doesn't pan out.
There's this one thing here you need to fix. Oh, but that revealed this other bug. Now I have to go fix that. And on and on and on. Yeah. There's another popular term for this. It's called yak shaving.
Absolutely.
You have a hole in your sock. So to fix the hole, you need some yarn. To get the yarn, you're not going to go to a store. You're going to go shave a yak and spin the yarn yourself.
I think when it comes to development as well, there's always another language to learn. There's always some new paradigm. There's always some new library to check out. It's really easy to fall into spending the time looking at the latest and greatest thing versus just solving the problem that you're out there to solve.
So how often do you try out new languages then?
On my part, not very often. I'm still very new to development in general. I did some Java in university, completely forgot all of it. I've done Python, Go, and now Ruby, and that's it. Go was for fun. Python and Ruby have been for work.
Yeah, very similar. I don't try many languages that often. I definitely read about them. Might try like a Hello World or a really simple application in them. But as far as trying to seriously use one, not super often. Although I think even just the keeping up with them and the latest changes and keeping your eye on them, that's one of those things that can take some time as well.
Learning a new programming language is a very big time investment versus installing a tool and then forgetting you have it.
I think one of the bigger time sinks that I see or that I experience myself is looking at the various libraries that are out there versus just coding something together. And that's one of those things that can take a lot of time to just survey the land and see what the latest and greatest is or what should be utilized.
So how do you make that decision then, whether to go looking for existing code versus writing it yourself?
The best way that I've heard is just experience. Either looking to some of the senior developers around you or perhaps managers. A lot of them have seen everything to some extent. They have a gut feeling of when this is going to be a rabbit hole or when this is going to be a hard topic. And in fact, actually, that's something I would say with your newer, more junior people, just knowing when you're out of your depth is something that comes with time and with a lot of experience. And it's knowing that, oh, this is a hard topic. It doesn't seem like a hard topic, but this is a hard topic. That's usually a time to step back and ask some questions or look around.
I've got a bit of personal experience with that recently. I need to implement database schema migrations in Willow, and I had no idea how to do that. So first, I was reaching for some ORM. ORM is Object Relational Mapping?
Mapping or mapper.
Yeah. It's a tool that lets you work with a database using your language constructs rather than having SQL inside your code base, for example. So my first thought was reach for an ORM and not really have to think about migrations because the ORM will usually have some sort of mechanism to take care of migrations for you. But I asked a very good friend of mine who's a very senior developer, and he said, oh, you don't actually need that. You can get much more performance from writing the SQL queries yourself, and migrations aren't actually that hard. And he just gave me like one file that I could copy paste from, and the whole migration system is extremely simple.
That's definitely sound advice. I've seen quite a few times where people will do something similar and have tons of migrations or very complex migrations that could all be simplified down into a single migration or not at all, just setting up the database.
So that was a situation where reaching for the tool someone else made was probably not the best choice, but it did take someone with a lot more experience than I had to point me in the better direction.
How about when you were picking up Go for the first time? Did you do anything special to your editor to get set up for that? Or did you just go with the vanilla experience that you were already using?
I actually don't remember. It's been a while. I think at the time I was probably using Vim, and I would have set up some sort of LSP integration with it rather than using it vanilla and just the command line tools.
Yeah, I think that's one of the points where whenever I'm learning something new like that, not to fall back into the just doing too much at once, but that's definitely the times where I start to reach for, oh, well, I wonder if there is a new plugin to do that, or a new set of snippets that I could just download and kind of have this stuff ready and handy for me. So I think that's probably the time when I look to do the most sharpening of my tools, is when I know I'm ready to make a change. However, there's definitely that delicate balance of keeping it simple.
I think part of my reasoning there was picking the language up a little bit easier, because when your editor has suggestions and hints and that kind of stuff, it is a very useful assistant, I guess. While doing it all in Vim means you have to be the one writing everything yourself. And I feel like just integrating an LSP is a smaller step towards simplification than installing a whole IDE like Goland and having to learn that just to learn a language.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by people who support us with PayPal and Patreon. Go to linuxdevtime.com/support for details of how you can support us too. Linux Dev Time is part of the Late Night Linux family, which means that for $10 a month on Patreon, you can get access to an RSS feed that contains all the Late Night Linux family shows without adverts like this. There's also an option to get just this show ad-free for $5 a month. Some of the episodes are even released a day or so early for Patreon supporters. So if you like what we do and can afford it, it'd be great if you could support us at linuxdevtime.com/support. In most creative endeavors, there's such a thing as like writer's block or creative block or lack of inspiration. Is that really a thing when it comes to development? Or if you've got a job to do you just have to get on and do it? Because the reason I ask that is when you're creating music, sometimes just totally changing your tools and going to a completely new workflow can be really inspirational and get you out of that funk. Is there ever a similar situation with development?
Oh, absolutely there is. I tell people all the time that developing is a creative art as well. Sometimes you just need those creative juices flowing. However, it also somewhat depends on how much greenfield development you're doing, how much brand new, versus just spinning out the same set of code that you've done a million times before already. But there can absolutely be a creative element to it where it definitely helps to change up your environment a little bit, or go take a walk, or come back and really get those creative thoughts going.
Taking a walk is fantastic advice, and so is sleeping on it and coming back to it the next day.
And then sometimes you dream about the problem and you dream about the solution.
Yep.
Sometimes the solution in your dream is entirely wrong. However, it gets you thinking in a whole new pattern, a whole new line of effort that you can then actually find the solution you were looking for.
So I get that, like, if you're working on a passion project or, your own personal thing, it can be really creative. But if you're doing work stuff where it's just like adding a feature that you've been told very specifically how it's all supposed to work and, it's all been whiteboarded and everything, doesn't that sometimes feel just like, almost like you're just a robot, just almost like GitHub Copilot could have done the job for you?
It definitely can. However, sometimes there's a lot of constraints and different invariants that you have to hold up in order to meet the feature, meet the deadline, whatever. And sometimes that can take a lot of creativity, whether it be how exactly you're going to attack the problem, or it could even be who you pull in to help you with, or how you get the team organized to do said feature. It can definitely take some creativity, even when it's just a boring, fix this bug, please.
It also depends massively on what kind of bug it is or what kind of feature it is. Some things are really simple, straightforward. You can just sit down, bang away for a few hours and it's done. Other things might require days of thinking and research before you land on a viable approach.
Exactly. That's assuming you even know how to reproduce the bug or where the bug is originating from in the first place. Sometimes that alone can take the creativity of how do I just reproduce this thing on my machine and not when I don't have the customer sitting right there with me, or customer logs or what have you.
And how long do you typically spend thinking about a problem versus actually writing the code? Like, what percentage would you say? I mean, it must depend, right, on what the problem is.
There is definitely more thinking that happens than actual typing. However, some of that thinking will happen through the typing, trying out different avenues or trying out little test cases or test programs just to see if a particular path is viable. That definitely happens a lot. And I would say a large, especially for the ones that take more creativity, there's definitely more thinking involved than actual typing. In fact, once you somewhat have the solution that you want to go with, even if it turns out to be the wrong one, that actual typing period is usually pretty small.
What about doing actual research then? Or, finding the relevant Stack Exchange post to copy paste from? How much time goes into that versus actual coding?
So I would say in recent experience, at least half of the time, but it really depends on if there's a deadline or not. If there's a hard deadline, what I'll usually do, not to go along that 50, 60% rule, but I'll try and find out as much as I can about the problem for at least the first 25% of that time and just figure out what I don't know. Because that's one of the hardest things to figure out is the things that you don't know, you don't know. Once I have a reasonable certainty that I've covered all of the bases, then I will go try to actually code some stuff up and try and meet that deadline.
Recently, that research to write ratio has gone way up. I'm spending a lot more time reading and trying to understand what I'm doing before I even put my fingers on the keyboard to type anything, because I'm learning a new language, new frameworks, trying to understand this code base I'm new to. There's so much I don't know and so much I don't know that I barely have any idea what I'm doing.
Isn't that just development in a nutshell?
Sometimes it's better, sometimes it's worse.
So I think that's a tricky part as well. You need to not let that bring in a paralysis to where you spend all of the time researching things that you may or may not know. A lot of times, especially if you're working with a good team, you will have people around you that can tell you, hey, you're starting to stray off into a different direction, or maybe you didn't think about this or think about that, or it's good enough, send it.
Communication is something I've been struggling with since I've started working remote exclusively.
Yeah, that's definitely a tricky topic and one that varies company by company. Some companies have that pretty nailed down. Other companies, not so much.
Right, well, we better get out of here then. We'll be back in a couple of weeks. But until then, I've been Joe.
I've been Amalith.
And I've been Kevin.
See you later.